All right, last clarification on this subject before we move on, because it's on YouTube right now. First and last ask in Revelation 25, chapter 20, verse 5. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years had ended. This is the first resurrection. Who will those be?
When it's talking about the first resurrection, when you go through the Bible, there are terms that are used for the resurrection. So, without making this a big old long thing, let me give you an example here. In John chapter 5, Jesus says, as the Father has life in himself, this is in verse 26, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he's the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth, those who've done good to the resurrection of life, and those who've done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. So as you go through the Bible, there's this phrasing, resurrection of life, resurrection of condemnation, the resurrection of the just, the resurrection of the unjust, the first resurrection and the second resurrection. And so in chapter 20, verse 5, when it says, but the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished, this is the first resurrection. What he's talking about is these are the righteous dead. These people are part of the first resurrection. But it doesn't just happen at one point, because obviously Jesus is righteous and he was raised from the dead. And those people in Matthew chapter 27, verse 52, they were righteous and they were raised from the dead. And then you're going to have the rapture of the church. They'll be righteous and they'll be raised from the dead. And then you have this resurrection of these people who have died during the tribulation. They're righteous and they'll be raised from the dead. And then we were just talking about those who will die following Jesus during the millennium. They would be righteous also. And so no matter what, and then you're talking about the Old Testament saints also, all the Old Testament believers. Whenever they're raised from the dead, they're righteous also. And so they are part of the first resurrection, or the resurrection of the just, or the resurrection of the righteous. So that's the first resurrection. It goes on and says, blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. And that's all those groups of people who are raised at different times. And we know for sure they're different times because there's already some of them that are raised from the dead, along with Jesus. Yep. Over such the second death has no power. And the second death is defined as those who've been raised from the dead and are at the great white throne judgment. And as it says in verse 14 of the same chapter, death and hell were cast in the lake of fire. This is the second death. That means everybody that was dead at that point are cast in the lake of fire. That's the second death. And so that's the resurrection of the unrighteous, or the resurrection of the unjust. And so two sets, you might say it this way, two sets of resurrections. Well, with the resurrection of the unjust, it's just one resurrection. But with the resurrection of the just, God does this a number of times, and finishes off with the righteous, and they are part of the first resurrection, whether they were raised at the time of Christ, or whether they're raised at the time of the rapture, or whether they're raised at the time of the resurrection of the believers who died during the tribulation period. That's all the first resurrection.
All right.
Is that clear as mud?
Clear as mud. There you have it.